this is arguably the greatest crisis humanity has ever faced. It is a civilizational breakdown crisis with strategic, scientific, cultural, and economic dimensions. On the financial front, we are being asphyxiated by a $2 quadrillion speculative bubble that is sucking all the oxygen out of the room. And our nations, at this point, and most political leaders, stand motionless, like a deer frozen in headlights, as we careen towards a monumental economic train wreck. With the international financial system already plunging into the precipice well before the pandemic struck, U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin threw gasoline on the fire by announcing on March 29th the largest financial bailout package in history. $4 trillion to be channeled through the Federal Reserve to bail out the hopelessly bankrupt transatlantic banking system. All of it, both in the United States and Europe. And all of that backstopped by the US Treasury, i.e., by American taxpayers. Again. You've heard of the quantitative easing scam that began during the 2008 crisis, and which on March 4th of this year stood at $4.2 trillion of funny money that the Fed had issued. By April 15th, that number had skyrocketed to $6.4 trillion, a 50% increase in just 6 weeks. Here's what it looks like on the Fed's own website. I did this screen grab because it really just speaks volumes. Slide 1, please. Now, this first slide shows you that it's happened with the Fed. But it's not just the Fed. If you look at slide 2, you will see in slide 2 that the ECB, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, and the Swiss National Bank are all in on the speculative orgy. The cumulative world total of QE stood at some $17 trillion at the beginning of this year. Then the floodgates were opened. And by the end of the first quarter of 2020, the total had soared past 20 trillion, which is indicated by the vertical broken line. If this were to continue at this rate, by the end of 2020, we'd be looking at some 30 trillion in QE. But that, of course, won't happen. Why? Slide 3. That's why. This kind of accelerating, damn the torpedoes hyperinflation of the asset bubble, while the physical economy around us is plunging into the abyss, is a formula for a financial thermonuclear explosion. Because while all of this was going on in the realm of the casino economy, US unemployment soared by nearly 27 million in the last 5 weeks, to the point that we now have a real unemployment rate in the 25 to 30% range, higher than the 1930s Great Depression. And as we will be hearing shortly, food production in the United States is on life support, or it would be if they could find an available ventilator. There are parts of the United States which are already facing third world conditions. Our prisons, our nursing homes, many of our inner cities with their tens of thousands of homeless. And of course, the third world is also facing third world conditions. Consider the situation of Africa in terms of a couple of parameters of underdevelopment of the physical economy. Next slide, please. 41% of Africans in sub-Saharan Africa endure extreme poverty, defined by the World Bank as income of less than $1.90 per day. But that dollar figure translates into some deadly physical economic parameters. 55% lack electricity. 55% of all urban dwellers live in slums. In Haiti, 80% of its 11 million people live in extreme poverty. And now, on top of all of that, the coronavirus pandemic and the global financial blowout are beginning to hit these countries. Next slide. Wash your hands frequently. Keep a social separation of 6 feet. You've got to be kidding. In Haiti, it is forecast that some 800,000 people could die from the coronavirus pandemic out of a population of 11 million. That is 7% of the population. It is hard to wrap your mind around such developments. It is even harder to wrap your emotions around them. How did it come to this? If only we'd known beforehand, so we could have taken steps to prevent it from happening. The video clip, please.
I would hope, and I think there are grounds for hope, that in the years to come you may look upon this day as one of the most important in your life. We are at this moment already in the middle of the worst crisis which European civilization has faced in 600 years, since the great banking collapse, which is associated with the term New Dark Ages during the 14th century. That was a time in which the entire banking system collapsed. It was then called the Lombard banking system. It was a time in which there had been over a century before, since the death of Frederick II Hohenstaufen, who had been the leader of Europe, of a process of degeneration of European civilization from the level it had achieved earlier. So that by the middle of the 14th century, with a long process of decay, and then the collapse of the banking system, the number of parishes and the population of Europe had fallen by 1/2 through famine, epidemics, and insanity, including religious insanity. Today, we're in a comparable situation, but much worse. Today, the crisis is not limited to European civilization. Today, it is worldwide. Today, already, Africa is being destroyed by a mass murder run by the largest power on this planet, the British Empire. The British Empire exists. Before the end of this century, every major part of the present international financial and monetary system will be gone, including the entire International Monetary Fund system and the present form of the Federal Reserve System here in the United States. They are doomed. They are gone. There are other things of which I'll speak. Under these conditions, unless we can replace the present IMF system, which is bankrupt and doomed, in the way you would leave the Titanic when it begins to sink, unless we get the passengers, the nations and the people, off this system before it sinks, this civilization globally is doomed to what we see developing in Africa, what is going on in the disintegration of Colombia under the patronage of the British drug queen, Queen Elizabeth II, and her local drug pusher, Sampo Pisano. The United States, too. This nation can be torn apart and destroyed in a very short period of time. I'm talking about months. Imagine the day in which every bank is bankrupt, in which the US dollar's convertibility is in question, a day in which the savings have been wiped out because the banks that contain them don't exist, a day in which all the mutual funds are long dead, and nobody can recover any money out of mutual funds. A day on which the New York Stock Exchange has dropped well below 1,000 from its present 8,000 vicinity, maybe to nearly zero. And the local bank with your savings in it is gone. Closed, not put to bankruptcy, just closed. Which there's no credit, there's no movement of food, or very little. There's no movement of services. What happens then to the United States as it is now happening in Africa and as it's spreading throughout Central and South America and in parts of Asia? When people don't eat, when sanitary conditions break down, when violence and desperation break out, what happens? The four horsemen of the apocalypse. And that is the breakdown of the whole system. That's the day the Titanic of world economy goes under the water, unless we do something about it. Now, I know what to do about it. What we need to do is very simple. Anyone who's a good lawyer knows what you have to do. When the bank goes bankrupt, what do? You have the government put it in bankruptcy. You reorganize it. What do you do when an entire banking system, like the U.S. banking system and credit system, goes bankrupt? You have the government, the federal government, together with the states, put the whole system into bankruptcy reorganization. We've done things like this before under wartime or similar emergency conditions, and we're going to have to do it again. Because if you don't rescue the country and the people, what have you got? We're coming to the time that we don't give a damn about the banks. We don't care about the stock market. We don't care about the major creditors, because we have to care about the people first.
Now, what does Larouche really mean when he says people first? Slide 6, please. Economic science is not financial or monetary, which is why economists with degrees from Harvard or Chicago or Yale were best quarantined, along with the Wall Street bankers whose criminal looting policies they justify with their writings, lectures, and advice to victim governments. Economic science is physical economy. Physical economy studies the way man uses his unique, distinguishing species characteristic, which is willful creativity, to change the physical universe around him through scientific discovery of universal physical principles and attendant technological advances, which lead to increases in his potential relative population density. Potential relative population density, a concept original to Lyndon LaRouche, and at the heart of his fundamental contribution to Leibniz's science of physical economy. This nonlinear metric, potential relative population density, corresponds to the power of society to maintain a rising total population with rising longevity, a rising standard of living, and with augmented access to classical culture, such that the rate of future scientific discovery and technological advance can outpace the growth of population per se. Simple, right? Now, this depends on the ability to produce improved market baskets of consumer goods, production goods, and infrastructure goods on a per capita and per square kilometer basis. If these fall, then society will predictably devolve to the point where the potential relative population density drops below the actual total population, as has happened globally over the last 50 years with the disastrous consequences we are witnessing with the coronavirus pandemic today. Next slide. What we are seeing today is a rerun of what happened in the 14th century explosion of the Black Death, which wiped out between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population of Europe at the time. when the potential relative population density plunges below the actual population and is not reversed quickly, then the only real question is which of the four horsemen of the apocalypse will ride first. Today, it is a global pandemic. We are only as strong as the weakest among us, which is why it is both scientifically incompetent as well as morally corrupt to brush aside the plight of Africa or Haiti or Guatemala or of the 40 million Americans who live in poverty, many of them in hunger as well. Lyndon Larouche rigorously proved that man characteristically lives in the future by using his creativity to place the present on the proper trajectory to achieve that intended future. Larouche referred to this as time-reversed causality. That is the essence of political organizing. Lyndon Larouche repeatedly identified the programmatic requirements to get the world back on track to the proper future, including in his famous 2014 Four New Laws, which specified four interrelated steps to be taken all at once. Number one, implement Glass-Steagall, or banking separation, between productive and speculative banking in the US and internationally. This would have the very advantageous effect of burying the City of London and Wall Street, as they say, where the sun don't shine. Number two, replace the bankrupt speculative financial system with the Hamiltonian credit system, including a return to the principles of a national bank, such as that established by our first Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton. Number three, use this federal credit system to, and here I quote Mr. Larouche, generate high productivity trends and improvements of employment with the intention to increase the physical economic productivity and standard of living of the persons and households of the United States. End quote. Reestablish a fixed parity international system based on agreements among such credit systems of sovereign nations, and use this to launch global infrastructure projects as benefit all the nations. In other words, transform the new Silk Road into a full-fledged world land bridge. And number four, reignite the fire of willful creative discovery and scientific breakthroughs, especially in the areas of fusion power, space exploration and colonization, and optical biophysics. Just consider what such an approach would signify if the United States, China, Russia, and India in particular, if they cooperated to lead the rest of the concert of nations forward into such a future. As the Schiller Institute's draft proposal, Larouche's Apollo mission to defeat the global pandemic, insists, quote, the world must join forces as a single humanity to stop the impending mass death in Africa, in particular, as the coronavirus spreads. Brigades of engineers, medics, and other skilled personnel from scores of nations must be mobilized, deployed, and coordinated under the United Nations and African Union, and with full respect for the sovereignty of all nations. Building health and sanitation infrastructure, assisting in supplying necessary medical and protective equipment, and assisting with administration of health systems are among the urgent jobs at hand. And that is also, I would add, how to reawaken and retool the collapsed industrial economies of the United States, Europe, and elsewhere. Let's get back to work, human work. But rather than elaborate on the practical steps of how each of Larouche's four laws can and must be implemented, I would prefer to leave you instead with the way Lynn himself addressed this matter.
What do you require in terms of investment in infrastructure? In terms of, like Washington, D.C., what kind of a sewer system do you require? What kind of power availability do you require? What kind of potable water system do you require? What do you require in terms of security to your neighborhood? All of these kinds of things, schools and so on. You require that. provided by society, it's provided by government chiefly. But you require it as part of your income. What's happened to our water systems? What's happened to our health systems? Then you require industry. You require technology to improve the society, to conquer the new problems we run into as we run society. You have to have an investment in industry. You have to have competent management that makes the thing work. You have to have improvement in product design. You have to have processes by which technology is advanced. These form market baskets which we can measure in terms of labor force, average member of labor force, average household, per person, and per square kilometer. This is sometimes called the energy of the system, of the economic system. What's the input you must supply to the population to maintain the system in good functioning order into the future, next generation? All right, that's been going down. That you see that the preservation of individual life and to extend it so that we may enjoy the blessings of the great individuals for a longer period of time is rather important and feasible. But in general, nonetheless, we're all going to die. And the question poses the question of what are we if we're all going to die? What does life mean if we're all going to die? Isn't that the question that government has to face? In real statecraft, in real law. Isn't that the question of do we provide for the individual the opportunity for a meaningful life? A life which can be so lived that it implicitly answers the question, what is the meaning of that travel, that transit from birth to death? This can only be answered in the realm of ideas. It's not possible for any animal in that way. Because if we are the bearers of great ideas, of truthful ideas, which we transmit to other generations, if we are custodians of the trust which is placed in us, the trust of humanity, while we are alive, if we are good custodians, if we solve problems when we must solve them because we're there to do it, if we contribute to the stock of ideas that make humanity better, cannot government say, without being accused of bringing in religion, cannot government say that the responsibility of government is to give to each person the opportunity to realize themselves as creatures made in the image of God within the universality and simultaneity of eternity? That should be the purpose of government. That, I believe, is the spirit of agape. And that is what we must do. And we must find the connection between the practical, which I've just summarily indicated, which is the measures we must take, and realize that the obstacle is not the measures, because these measures are quite feasible and they're based on many precedents which we can call upon in terms of respect to implementation. The problem is the need for the will, the commitment, the passion to make the change. And a great challenge before us in the room here today, and many others like us, is to become like a virus, to infect humanity with optimism and with the means to find the will to bring about the change. And if we can do that, and you have benefited in any degree, either from what I've said today or the repercussions of it in the time ahead, then I hope this may have been the most important day in your life. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Lynn.